Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this one, we'll be talking about Austrian school economics, mostly with a focus on how it applies to the business cycle. So, as I told you in the last one, some economists believed that Keynes had it totally wrong. Keynesianism was the main economic doctrine in its day. It was kind of the foundations of macroeconomics as we know it. And even when later critics came along, like, say, Milton Friedman with his monetarism theory, Keynesianism ultimately grew to synthesize itself with it. Keynesianism would merge with its critics. It would take on more nuance, uh, adapt other theories into its models, into its framework. But the Austrian school, they would have none of it. They were completely opposed to central banking. They were completely opposed to the concept of stimulus. They argued that Keynesian interventions were actually poisoning the world economy because they were one of the main forces causing recessions. They were the cure and they were the cause. And together, they were acting as a destabilizing influence. So, who are these Austrians? Well, the first thing to understand is that when we speak of a school in economics, we don't mean a college. There is no, like, you can't go get a degree from the Austrian school. It's a school of thought. And it's named that, like most of our schools are, because most of the founding figures of it were from Austria, mid 1900s Austria. Personally, I've always found this very interesting because most people, if you ask them, like, who was the most influential thinker of mid 1900s Austria, they'd say Hitler. But these Austrian school guys were as far away from Hitler as you could get. They were super free market. Um, you know, the Nazis. I don't think this. It won't have come up in any of the lecturing I've done with you. I talk about this in the fall and spring. Fascism is a totalitarian ideology. I just want you to understand that fascism has private property, unlike communism, but it also has an all-powerful government that has an unlimited ability to intervene in the economy to tell people how they manage their private property. So it's not a it often preserves markets in the sense that you choose where you work, you can open a business, and so on and so forth. But people's ability to make decisions about how they run the business are so constrained that it's primarily being determined by the government, not by the action of the market itself. You get a lot of price controls and central planning in a fascist economy. You get a lot of nationalization of major industries in a fascist economy. I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but the big thing is these Austrian school economists, even at the same time that their own country was descending into one of the bloodiest, nastiest totalitarian regimes of all time, they were moving in the exact opposite direction. And frankly, I think that was probably one of the main reasons why. They saw their own country killing itself through national socialism. And so they walked away with a complete rejection of socialism in general. These Austrian school guys are going to be 100% free market in just about every way. Many of them are libertarians, many of them are anarchists. But what they all share is a certain attitude towards science and philosophy. And these Austrian school guys are also going to be what's called heterodox, meaning not mainstream, not orthodox. That word orthodox, right? That literally translates to something like true belief. Usually you hear it in religious contexts, especially with things like Orthodox Jews or the Orthodox Church. Well, it has kind of, and this is a little disturbing in my opinion, it has kind of the same implication in science as well. When you say that something is the orthodox theory within science, you mean it's the one that is considered correct. It's the one that they would put in a textbook, that they would teach people. But the thing about science is that science often changes. A theory will be heterodox, think heretical, wrong, evil. It will be heterodox in one year, and then it'll be orthodox in the next, as people prove and disprove different ideas. So, for example, when you think of like astronomy, right, that's always the very vivid one people imagine. You have your Ptolemaic model of astronomy, where everything revolves around the Earth. And then you have your Galilean model of it, where, well, really we say Copernican, but I picked Galileo because of his feud with the church. You have your Galileo and Copernicus, where the Earth revolves around the sun. And for a while, it was not clear which one was correct. When people made that change from Ptolemy to Galileo, they didn't, there was no like one moment where everyone realized that they had just been stupid and that they needed to throw out all their old textbooks and burn them. There was a bit of plausibility to both, and it came from a long dialogue. And the later theories built on the earlier theories. Well, this is what happens in economics too. You have this mainstream body of theory that most people roughly agree on, but then you'll have weird stuff at the edges, weird stuff that is just a little too different and spicy. Maybe it has a fundamentally different way of looking at the world, a fundamentally different methodology or conclusions, but it exists outside the bounds of normal social science. Marxism is the same way. In some ways, you can think of it as, because we're going to talk about Marxism in the next video, but in some ways, you can think of it as you've got your mainstream in the middle, and like Keynes and Friedman, they're both hanging out in the middle. And then way on the right, you have these Austrians, and then way on the left, you have Marx. Super pro big government, super middle milquetoast and boring, and then super anti-government. Now, what do these Austrians believe? Well, they believed that everything should be based on what they called praxeology, which more or less translates to rational choice. They believed that economics should be approached not as a social science, but more like philosophy in the manner that the ancient Greeks did it. As much of it is going to be verbal as possible instead of being mathematical. And we're going to start from axioms. Just like the Greeks built mathematics from axioms, that they built logic from axioms. We should be able to define things. We should be able to make predictions. But more than anything, all of these axioms are to be based not on observation, but based on assumptions about human nature and human motivation. They often like this phrase, human action. See, the Austrians were in some ways a reaction to the excessive scientism of their own time. There was a movement in science called positivism and a movement called empiricism, both closely related back in the 1800s. And they essentially denigrated alternative ways of knowing something like intuition or epiphanies, religious revelation. They rejected all of these kind of traditional ways of thinking in favor of pure scientific method. I should be able to experiment on everything and prove everything with experiments. And the Austrians didn't reject the scientific mindset when it came to physical life, but they didn't believe that it could be reliably done in the social sciences, both because of the nature of how humans act, that humans are rational creatures, that they don't just respond to everything in the same way like an animal. Well, honestly, I think animals are very similar to people. They don't respond to things like, say, a plant would. And statistics can lie. The world is an incredibly complex place. You can torture statistics to make them say anything you want. Believe me, the more you study statistics, the less regard you have for statistics. If you learn how to do regression analysis, that's what most scientific experiments revolve around. You learn regression analysis, you're never going to be able to trust anything you read ever again, because you'll know all the dirty tricks that people learn to lie. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Uh, More than anything, the Austrians believed that there needed to be a sort of humility about our ability to understand the world. They believed there was no way to meaningfully collect the data necessary to derive like laws about the market. They believed that people were so unpredictable that you could not use like historical trends to predict the future. They thought that the only way to do social science was to do it as philosophy through a sort of combination of intuition, sort of gut feelings, vibes, and also through this rigorous axiomatic approach. Okay, people are rational. How would a person respond to something? We have to always be thinking in terms of how motivated thinkers respond to things. And if the data disagrees, I'm going to question the data before I question my theory. My theory can be wrong, and I have to consider that possibility. But I think it's more likely that the world gives me bad data or a bad experiment than that my logic breaks down. Now, this was the main thing that made the Austrians heterodox. The fact that they did not like playing with numbers at a time when the world started to make a fetish out of playing with numbers. A lot of their ideas ended up not just being implemented in mainstream economics, but being extremely influential in it. Back before the Austrians came along, everyone used this thing called the labor theory of value. I don't really talk about it in here. I don't care, right? Nobody uses it anymore. It's dead, and for a good reason. But if you're ever reading about like communism, you might see this pop up. Well, Adam Smith is one of the first people to talk about the labor theory of value. David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, Karl Marx. A lot of your early classical and Marxist economists used the labor theory of value. And there were flaws with it. There were problems with the logic of it that led to very bad predictions and bad conclusions. Well, the Austrians come along and they ditched the thing. And they replaced it with what we now call marginalism, or the subjective theory of value, which you got exposed to way back at the start in the marginal principle lecture. Essentially, we don't try to measure objective value because no such thing exists. It's all personal. But what we can show is that interpersonal exchange raises value for both parties involved. Now, the main guy we're going to be talking about today is Friedrich Hayek. He was not the founder of the school, but he was the one that like has most relevance to us. And Hayek had two main contributions to economics. Firstly, he had a concept developed straight from the source, Adam Smith, called spontaneous order. See, Hayek was fascinated with this invisible hand idea. He was fascinated by the notion that a market could coordinate people's actions to serve some kind of greater purpose, like the continued existence of society, without any individual thinker having to direct it. In a way, what the market did was it created order out of chaos. And that's what most people saw. Most people, when they would look on the capitalist world, whether as supporters of it or critics of it, one of the things that seemed to define it was just how messy it is. Everyone's doing their own thing. Nobody's in control. People are getting laid off. People are getting hired. Businesses are going under. Businesses are popping into existence. It's endless churn, endless noise. Often it would seem that there was a lot of unnecessary, redundancy in capitalism. Why does every town have to have 1 million Mexican restaurants? Well, the Austrians were the sort of people who'd say, because people want them. But what made Hayek's mind different was that, like Smith, he would look on this very chaotic world. He would accept it as chaotic. He would accept it as being beyond his or anybody else's comprehension. And yet, instead of shuddering and turning away from it, he realized that there were greater forces at work. The market was steering people. The market was drawing together everybody's minds. And when I say the market, understand the market only exists as a description for the way our interactions, tie us to each other. The market didn't exist before men. Men created the market. The market spawned out of them. But anytime you have more than two cavemen together, they start to form competitive markets. People have seen, like, for example, in World War II prisoner of war camps, the prisoners would get these rations. They get like a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, food. Aside from what the Germans gave them, they would also get, gifts from the Red Cross. And something that amazed a lot of people is that with nobody telling them to do it, they started to automatically create elaborate markets for the different items in the ration kits. They automatically created a commodity currency in the form of cigarettes. And before long, prisoners were even running cigarette banks. Social convention emerges on its own. It emerges from people butting heads with each other, interacting repeatedly. You have this problem. People are trying to barter. It's just like, back when you were a kid at lunch, you don't want your chocolate milk. They don't want their mac and cheese. And so you're trying to exchange. Well, there was no king of the prison yard. The Germans didn't tell them to do this. But on their own, these American servicemen start to kind of recreate society in the image of what they had back home. And nobody's making them do it. Hayek and Smith also both recognized that this process which alarmed so many people, whether reformists or kings, socialists or reactionaries, they recognized that this was the way nature works. Hayek called this emergent order. When it's just nature without the human aspect, it's emergent. When you add humanity, it's spontaneous. But you'd have things like, for example, the movements of the heavens, something that enraptured ancient man, for time immemorial. The way that the stars and planets would move around in these elaborate repeating patterns. And it's all being done under the action of gravity. Something has a velocity, it has a mass. Based on all these different rules, all these different natural principles, objects get drawn into paths where they're stable, where there's an equilibrium of sorts. And it'll play itself out forever until some kind of force comes in and disturbs it. Like clockwork. You see this in the material world down here. Crystals are minerals that grow and they organize themselves into repeating patterns. They happen to have certain chemical properties that they create a kind of lattice, and when more mineral gets added to it, it sorts it in, and you wind up growing things like geodes that way. And living things do this. Living things maintain homeostasis, right? They have an internal state. Your body burns at a certain temperature. It burns a certain amount of food. It breathes. It sends all the nutrients to where they need to go. And you grow and you reproduce. And at a higher level, societies do this. At a higher level, whole ecosystems do this. They have an internal state where every animal, every plant is in balance with the others. And as long as there are still slack resources open, they will grow into them. Smith and Hayek, I told you with Smith, he was drawing kind of from the tradition of natural theology in his day that saw this all in a manner similar to what a lot of Christians nowadays would call intelligent design. Hayek was not a religious person. Hayek is working more in the days of Darwin. Smith actually anticipates Darwin. Smith has writings, Smith and his friend Hume, they have writings about ecology long before Darwin ever develops a theory of evolution. But Hayek lived in an age where Darwinism had already become scientific orthodoxy. And he is fascinated by this stuff. And like Smith, he's fascinated not just that it occurs in nature, but that it occurs in human society too. We're a part of nature. And the most natural order for us is not one where people subject themselves to some kind of central authority where we try to live like ants or bees, but one where people are wheeling and dealing for themselves. Rather than try to control others, you kind of meld into the world. You accept your own direction in it, your own flow. And when people do that, when people don't disturb each other, you end up getting this natural flourishing. It's order, but it's spontaneous. And to quote from him directly, it's the products of human action, but not of human design. Nobody plans it, and nobody ever could plan it because the world is too complex. I think I forgot to include it, didn't I? These guys also invent the economic calculation problem, which mainstream economics goes on to accept. Now, Hayek was everything that Keynes wasn't. Keynes is a wild, crazy dude. Keynes is running around boozing and banging and hanging out with celebrities. Hayek is a cold, austere, serious man. Keynes is the life of the party. Hayek is the kind of guy that the party ends the moment he walks into the room because he bums everyone out. Keynes comes from a bureaucratic family. His daddy was in the civil service. He's in the civil service. He spends World War I working for the British government, and he ends up writing the big treatise that says, hey, if you try to saddle Germany with debts that they'll never be able to repay, you're just going to have another war. What does Hayek do during World War I? He sits in a trench getting shelled in Italy. If you know your Hemingway, right, you know, like A Farewell to Arms, you have the Italian front, Austria versus Italy. That's what Hayek's doing. He's sitting in the Alps getting bombed. And it ends up making a big impact on him because it was such a miserable time that it really jaded him to the nature of, well, not of humanity. He doesn't blame humanity for it, but of the state. The state was the one that put the gun to his back and made him go out and sit in that trench. He's a secular type, but like Smith, he has this touch of mystic in him. He even has this Greek word he likes to use as a synonym for spontaneous order. He calls it cosmos, like the world. And he sees this tension in the world. You have human ambitions pit against the forces of nature. You have people trying to sort of restrain the humanity of other people by restraining the options before them, controlling the choices they can make. But it goes against the will of what the world wants to be. And all of this is going to put him and his other Austrian buddies on a collision course with Keynes, because their two worldviews are just irreconcilable. Keynes is Mr. Civil Servant. He's someone whose whole life, right, even his upbringing, has come from government largesse. And naturally, Keynes is a very conservative figure. He wants to protect the system. He likes the capitalist democratic system. But he thinks the government can shackle it. Hayek, he's the opposite. He has this sort of dread about the idea of people trying to meddle with things beyond their comprehension.